Thanks for tuning in for another episode of our series of CIRP's mental health webinars. Enjoy and let us know your thoughts in the comments below.
Hello everyone and welcome to our weekly mental health webinar. My name is Nicole and I am the Program Assistant for Construction Rehab. I'll be running this webinar in the background, so let me just point out a few things to orientate everyone. On the screen is a little orientation to the platform. On the left is what the platform looks like on a laptop, and on the right is what it looks like on a mobile device. The first thing to notice is that there's a chat. On the laptop, you can simply type and press enter, while on the mobile version, you have to first tap the chat button and then type. Tapping the chat button again will minimize the chat. The next thing to notice is the Ask a Question button. On the mobile version, you may have to scroll to the right to see the Ask a Question button, depending on how large your screen is. Click or tap the button and you can type in and ask a question. Please remember that the questions, like the chat, is public, so anything you say will be available to everyone. Because the questions are public, once questions are asked, you can upvote and downvote questions you would like answered. I will be monitoring the Ask a Question section, so vote for the questions you want answered. Lastly, there is a poll button. If you click on the poll button, you can see that there are a few polls set up already. There may be a few more set up throughout the crowdcast. Please cast your votes during the webinar. Again, on the mobile devices, you may have to scroll to the right to find the polls button. Click or tap on the button and you can vote. Once you have voted, click or tap the polls button again to close the poll. That's all for now. Vicky will now take it away.
Thanks, Nicole. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us again. We're really pleased to be doing this. For those of you who are new, just to let you know, my name is Vicky Waldron. I'm the Executive Director of Construction Rehab. Construction Rehab is a mental health and substance use program for all members of the BC Building Trades and CLRA, so Construction Labour Relations Association. Not only do we provide services, a whole raft of services for members themselves, we also provide services for your family members. So if there's anyone within your family that needs mental health and substance use support or we can do that too. Okay, so really pleased to be doing this today. And so today we're talking about loneliness. We're talking about loneliness, isolation, and forgottenness. But before I start, I think a confession first. Forgottenness isn't actually a technical term. It's a term that we use to describe aloneness, isolation. And it's a term that's it refers to somebody's sense of how they're feeling at any one time. We know that people that struggle with loneliness often have this sense of forgottenness. But just a bit of a confession, it's not actually a technical term. So what is loneliness and what is aloneness or loneliness and isolation? So during COVID, one of the things that we're finding is that we hear a lot in the news and the media about loneliness and isolation. You know, people are feeling isolated, they're feeling lonely. Often these terms are used interchangeably. But in fact, in psychology, we know that these two terms aren't the same thing. They're actually two very distinct different terms. So loneliness refers to it's a subjective experience of an emotional disconnection from another person. You can feel lonely when you are surrounded by people, and I'm sure many of us have had that experience at some point or another in our lives before. You can be connected to other people, you can be physically close to other people. You can be surrounded by people, but you can feel incredibly lonely. And that's because loneliness is actually about our subjective experience, this emotional disconnection we have with others. It's a psychological experience. And it's often one of the things that we will often hear when we talk about loneliness, certainly on the program or when we talk with our clients. We have the word forgotten often comes up. So people will often talk about feeling as though they're forgotten by other people. And again, that feeling comes up when we are emotionally disconnected from another person. And it's that emotional disconnection is often the gap between where we would want to be with another person and where we actually are with that person. So again, very subjective. aloneness or isolation, that is a completely different state. That is where it's a state of removing oneself from other people. So that is when we consciously choose to step back, and that can be a very positive thing. That can be, you know, when there's too much going on and we need alone time, or we need me time. It's that physical distancing of yourself from another person or people. So very different. It's really, one is about the quantity of relationships, and that's the aloneness, and the other is about the quality of your relationships, and that's the loneliness that people feel. It's that subjective experience. So within loneliness itself, and loneliness is what we're really talking about today. Loneliness is, there are 4 typologies within loneliness, and that's 4 systems of loneliness. We know that as a construct, there's 4 real domains that make up loneliness. There's social loneliness, family loneliness, emotional loneliness, and romantic loneliness. What we're really going to be talking about today within today's session is about emotional loneliness. That's the real feeling of being forgotten by another, or feeling emotionally disconnected from another human being or people. So when we feel this emotional loneliness, it's usually connected to romantic relationships and family relationships. So it's people, we might feel an intense sense of loneliness because we don't have a partner that we're spending our life with. We don't have that intimate relationship that we might be seeking. Or it might be that we are disconnected from family members. So it might feel that, you know, we're physically disconnected, and therefore that can lead to emotional disconnection, and someone's not available to us physically, therefore we feel emotionally disconnected from that person. There's also acute loneliness and chronic loneliness. Now this is where things get interesting. Acute loneliness is actually a very healthy thing. Acute loneliness is actually an evolutionary thing. It makes sure that that there is a success, that our species goes on, it continues. There's a drive, it's known as a motivational drive. So we have many drives in our bodies. So we have, for example, a hunger drive. A hunger drive is, again, evolutionary. It's a motivational drive. It forces you to go out and eat so that you survive, right? We have procreational drives, so that we can ensure the success of our species. We continue to produce more human beings, and we can keep the species going. Loneliness is actually seen as one of those drives. It's seen as a motivational drive. When we are lonely, we are driven to go out and seek connection with other human beings. And when we are seeking that connection with other human beings, we can make sure that our species survive. So it's a very evolutionary thing that exists within us. And also we're built to seek out human connection with other people. We actually have chemicals in the brain that are designed for us to do this. There's a chemical in our brain called oxytocin. This chemical is really, or you might have heard of this, some people know this as the love chemical in our brains. It's that huge rush of warm, fuzzy feelings that we get when we are connected to another person. It's also the feeling that people get, this really warm, fuzzy feeling people get when we have massages. I don't know if anybody out there has had massages. In fact, I don't know anyone that A, hasn't had a massage, and B, doesn't like massages. And the reason for that is when we have human skin-to-skin contact, that releases oxytocin. And again, this chemical that we have is really designed for us to go out and connect with other people. So acute short-term loneliness is actually very healthy. We actually have a system in our brain, or rather there's a location in the brain that is actually where we experience those feelings of loneliness. It becomes maladaptive, however, when we have chronic loneliness. Chronic loneliness is the complete opposite of healthy. It is incredibly unhealthy for us. It prevents the success of our species. It means that we're not going out and connecting with other human beings. We also know that it causes disease. We know that there's psychological impacts, quite severe psychological impacts of loneliness, and we know that there are physiological impacts of loneliness. As human beings, we're not designed to be lonely over long periods of time. So chronic loneliness, we do know, and research tells us it's actually quite detrimental to our health. The research shows us that if, for example, you have people that have chronic loneliness, they are twice as likely as non-lonely people to develop Alzheimer's. Now that's quite a startling stat. That to me blows my mind, quite frankly. The fact that if through chronic loneliness you are more than double your chances of getting Alzheimer's disease. We also know that there's a correlation between loneliness and cognitive decline. So we know that as loneliness increases, our healthy cognition starts to decline. Our capacity to use our brain starts to decline. So as loneliness increases, our capacity to use our brain fully starts to decline. We also know that the odds of dying earlier are greater when you have chronic loneliness. So for example, just to put that in context for you, people that live in areas where there is really bad air pollution, they have a 5% chance of dying earlier from air pollution. People with obesity, people with obesity have a 20% chance of dying earlier compared to people that don't have obesity. Even with excessive alcohol use, we know that people that use unhealthy amounts of alcohol, your chances of dying earlier when compared to someone that isn't doing that is 35%. Then you go look at loneliness. If you have chronic loneliness, when you compare that to people that don't have chronic loneliness, you are 45% more likely to die earlier. That's, again, a staggering number. It's a very, very high number. So it really does, there's a really big, a large probability that is, you are reducing your lifespan when we experience chronic loneliness. We also know that people that have chronic loneliness they have something called the reversal learning extinction. They have less of this. So reversal learning extinction this is what our brain does. When we do something that doesn't work for us, our brain learns from it and it goes, oh, I don't want to do that again. So for example, I make a bad decision. I talk to somebody, I say the wrong thing, that person reacts badly. There's a whole situation happens sometimes. There's a whole situation that happens, but my brain learns from that. It says, you know what, you don't want to do that again, Vicky, because that led to a negative outcome. People that struggle with chronic loneliness, they have a reduced capacity for that process. So people that have chronic loneliness are less likely to learn from behaviours that weren't useful to them. And again, that's been shown in research. We know that people that struggle with chronic loneliness have poorer IQ across the board, and they also have poor memory over different domains. So poorer long-term memory, poorer short-term memory as well, poorer working memory. We also know that there's a physiological impact of what happens. There's a reduced immune system. People that have chronic loneliness were shown to have greater rates of depression. They were shown to have increased cortisol levels. Cortisol is our stress hormone. So whenever we are feeling stressed, our brain releases a whole ton of cortisol. So when we have people that experience chronic loneliness, we find that they have increased levels of cortisol, and cortisol is directly related to stress. We have chronic inflammation in the body, so things like arthritis, they tend to have worse arthritis, or they have increased rates of arthritis. There's also an executive functioning decline. The executive functioning part of the brain is located in the prefrontal cortex, and it's a part of the brain that does the reasoning. It's the part of the brain that is, I call it sensible. when I'm giving an example, it's usually the part of my brain when I'm having, you know, I've had a slice of pizza, I've had 2 slices of pizza, I'm now coming on to my 4th or 5th slice. It's the part of the brain that says, yeah, you really don't want to do that. You don't need that 5th slice, and you're going to regret that 5th slice. So it's that part of the brain. It's the part of the brain that's sensible. And so what we find is that when people with chronic loneliness, we've had there's scans that show that part of the brain is actually smaller. And so that reduces one's capacity to have that kind of executive functioning, to have that sensible part of the brain function as well. There's less emotional regulation that happens. There's increased impulsivity. Now, this particular piece is very interesting to me. When we look at less emotional regulation and we look at increased impulsivity, I often look at that in terms of in the role that we do within substance use, for example. So you can see that that there is these things increase. So when there is substance use, you get that increased impulsivity, you get that reduced emotional regulation. So there is a connection between chronic loneliness and substance use. There's a decreased attention span as well. We know that, you know, in many studies, it's been shown that people that have chronic loneliness are unable to focus. It's very difficult to focus. It's to keep your concentration going for periods of time, extended periods of time. That becomes a lot more difficult. We know that people are less likely to engage in exercise if there's chronic loneliness. One of the sadder things about chronic loneliness for me is that we know that there's this thing called loneliness contagion, and that is where it spreads almost like a virus. It spreads like a disease. So what happens is when you have a social network and you feel lonely, and remember, this is a very subjective experience. This isn't an actual factual experience, it's subjective. I feel disconnected from another person, so I feel lonely. And so people that feel disconnected from other human beings tend to move to the outer edges of their social networks. We know that people that feel chronic loneliness, or they feel this disconnection from other human beings, the way that they're thinking, their thought processes can often become negative. It can be they tend to focus on what they don't have, and so this as they push themselves to the edges of their networks, when they are connecting with their friends might feel, oh, Vicky's not connecting as much, she doesn't speak as much, she doesn't reach out as much. Maybe it's because there's something going on with me, maybe there's something wrong with me. And so it's almost like this loneliness becomes catching. So that person then starts to disconnect from other people, and then this snowball, this catch-22 thing happens, where loneliness does tend to spread throughout communities, throughout social networks. It's quite sad, actually. Okay, so just to kind of cap it up, I think short-term loneliness is actually a very natural and useful response. It's something we should have, and it helps us to connect with other people. It becomes a problem when it's chronic, when this is something that's going on, that's been going on for a long time. And I always want to say, you know, just remember that loneliness is never just loneliness. We should never just ignore people that are talking about loneliness, or that are struggling with loneliness. It's actually so much more than that. It has such a profound impact on psychological and physiological health. So I'm hoping that there's some questions from you guys, and I'm hoping that I can answer some questions for you.
All right, Vicky, thank you so much for that presentation. Lots of things to take away. So we do have a couple of questions from our audience. The first one is, because we're talking about loneliness, and a lot of loneliness comes from the relationships that we have, how do you move on from losing a loved one if you're feeling lonely?
Yeah, so that's it's a heartbreaking one, and whoever is going through that, I really do feel for you. That's just the most profound amount of loneliness, when you feel that emotional connection and it's actually been severed, not through choice. That's really difficult. So how do you move on? I think moving on in and of itself is a very difficult concept to kind of wrap your heads around. I think what we find is that people can struggle with the term moving on. Some people will feel a lot of guilt, as in I shouldn't move on, or I've forgotten the person that I loved so dearly. And so the term moving on is a little bit problematic. It can be hard for people to grapple, and often people will have what we call cognitive dissonance. I want to move on, but I shouldn't move on because it doesn't do my loved one's memory justice. And so they grapple with that. So what we actually talk about is we don't really focus on moving on. What we focus on is other things. So healing from the loss of that loved one, helping you to grieve the loss of your loved one. When you start to heal from the loss of somebody, we naturally, almost as a side effect, we will start to move on. We don't want to focus on that because that in and of itself can cause distress for people, and it can become something that they grapple, like, I want to do this, but I really shouldn't do this, or, you know, what does this say about me if I move on? Am I moving on too quickly? You know, how am I moving on? So we tend not to focus on that. We tend to focus more on the healing, the self-healing, and then hopefully a byproduct is that somebody does move on. I hope that's helpful.
And then kind of to go along with the next two questions, we've got a theme of being very busy and having a lot of contact with people, such as work, but then is it possible to still suffer from chronic loneliness?
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think that's a great question. Many of us have that, where we are surrounded by people and feel desperately lonely, and it's because we don't have that emotional connectedness with another person, and that rarely comes from that deep satisfaction from being connected to another person rarely comes from work colleagues. And here's why. When we speak to work colleagues, we're not talking about our intimate personal moments. We're not revealing ourselves. We're not bearing our souls to that person. And because we're not doing that, it's very difficult to feel that emotional connectedness to somebody. You can feel that at a certain level, but it never really goes, it can be unsatisfying if that's the only place we're looking for that connectedness. Emotional connectedness to another human being really does come when we are able to really talk about our deepest fears, be incredibly vulnerable with that person, and that other person in turn is vulnerable with us. And that's usually where the romantic relationships, those connections are where we get that deep emotional connection and with other people, because that's really where we tend to place those kind of vulnerabilities. You're less likely to do that at work. You know, I don't want to go to work and tell, you know, my board members my deep, dark, you know, vulnerabilities. It's not how we function. To be quite honest with you, if I did that, they'd probably be scratching their heads and not knowing what to do with it. But it's just not what we do. So yes, absolutely, you can feel surrounded by work colleagues and still feel this chronic loneliness that goes on. If that is going on for you, what I would recommend and what I'd really want to be working on is reach out to a mental health professional and kind of talk about this. But really the goals would be to kind of say, okay, who do you have in your life, a good friend, a person, as part of your social network, maybe a romantic partner or family members that you have this deep connection with, or you can form and foster this deep connection. Now, the other thing I should say about that is we often assume that this is something magical and it just happens. You know, you just have this a deep emotional connection with people, and that's not always the case. Sadly, we're not taught how to be emotionally vulnerable at school. We're taught how to do math, how to learn grammar and the history, you know, of all the kings and queens, in my case, that came before the queen that we have right now, all stuff like that. We're never taught how to emotionally connect to another person. So I don't, I think there's a lot of value to recognizing that having learning how to be emotionally connected to somebody isn't a natural thing. It's something we have to be taught. It's also something that has to be modeled to us. If it wasn't modeled to us as parents, then we're not going to know how to do that. But again, reaching out to a mental health professional can help with that.
Thanks, Vicky. Great suggestions. We have another question here that says, if you are concerned someone is resisting contact, disconnecting with friends, how can you check in and potentially move past the resistance to real connection without being a pest?
That's a really good one. So somebody's noticed that you've noticed loneliness, or you recognize perhaps loneliness. I think the first thing we really have to do is separate isolation from loneliness, and that's really important. Somebody might be separating because they're overwhelmed and they just need a bit of quiet time. However, if this is something that you are fairly sure is not isolation and is loneliness, one of the quickest ways to connect to another person is really be vulnerable yourself. Reach out to that person, be vulnerable, let them know that actually they mean a lot to you. Because remember, people that feel lonely, have this chronic sense of loneliness, feel forgotten, as if nobody cares, and they don't feel that deep connection. So reach out, and I would be telling them, you're important in my life, and I've actually really missed not having you there. I've missed talking to you and being able to share things with you. You're valuable to me. That's what I would recommend. I think that's the first thing that you can do is reach out and just maybe let them know that they're not forgotten.
All right. And then we have another question here. How do you fight depression and anxiety and still live your life?
Yeah, the $1 million question. So I would say to you, first and foremost, you absolutely can do that. It's absolutely doable. What I will say to you is, unfortunately, as much as we often want, this magic pill, one doesn't exist. It really doesn't. I would say that there are definite strategies that can be implemented. There's definite tools that we can use, and mental health professionals can help you with those. They can teach you those tools, and that's part of the job that we do. We want you, one of my little taglines that I say often is, we teach you to become your own counsellor, right? So we teach you, nothing that we do is magical or mystical. We don't work behind a green curtain. It's really about teaching you how to do that. So there are techniques, and I think they're too complex to kind of go into a lot of detail, but there is one technique that I can give you that has been shown to be as effective as an antidepressant. So I'm going to say that again. There's one technique that you can implement that has been shown to be as effective as an antidepressant pill, and that's gratitude. And that might seem really airy-fairy and kind of hippy-dippy, but in fact, there's hard, solid research that says if you practice gratitude every day, routinely, you will reduce your rates of anxiety, you will reduce the rate of depression, and it's as effective as a pill. It absolutely, and we've got lots of research that supports that. So I would be suggesting a daily gratitude journal. If you Google it, you'll find lots of, you can actually buy gratitude journals that are already laid out and you just fill it out, or there's lots of information on how to start practicing a gratitude journal.
That's such a great suggestion. The gratitude journal is also something that we've talked about before.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then particularly because we're living in this time of COVID, what strategies can someone use to manage loneliness at this time?
Yeah, I think that's and I think that's a great question. We're in unprecedented times. We've never had to navigate this situation before. This is very new to us. So that question is a really good question for me, because I think one of the things that I'm noticing is when we've been told to isolate, we have to kind of consciously remember this is physical isolation. It's not emotional isolation. We're not expecting anyone to be emotionally isolating from other people. But what happens is, because a lot of our connectedness comes from being physically close to another person, without paying conscious attention to it, when we are physically distancing ourselves, we start to emotionally distance ourselves. So one of the things that I've been recommended to my team, to clients, is really jump onto the Zoom and the Zoom. How old do I sound? Really jump onto Zoom or any other video medium you can find, and have the conversations you would normally be having with loved ones, but do it via video. You know, if you normally meet somebody once a week for dinner, do it via Zoom. Arrange to have, you know, you're both going to eat the same thing. Have after work drinks with friends that you would normally connect with and feel emotionally connected to. Just do it on Zoom. So for now, what we've got to remember is we physically isolate, but we don't emotionally isolate. So it's super important to make sure that you're reaching out to people.
That's a really good point. It's so important to keep in touch with people in this time.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, if there are no more questions, then I would like to thank Vicky for the presentation. I'm going to remind everyone to vote in the polls before we close the window. Please click on the link as well that says check Facebook event for more information. We have had a last minute question. We've had a question last minute, maybe Vicky you can answer quickly. Does getting a pet such as a dog help at all?
Yeah, Vicky answering a question quickly. Now there's a novel idea. Okay. Short, simple answer, yes. Research supports that emotional connectedness can happen with animals. In fact, we know that happens a lot in the downtown east side, where folk are very disconnected from families. It's very rare to find anybody down there that actually has a family member that they are in contact with. Animals are huge. Animals, in short, yes, absolutely. They can help with emotional loneliness.
All right, great. All good excuses to get a dog.
I remind everybody, log in next week, come join us. And also, if there's any topics you want us to talk about, let us know. Email us, put it on the polls, contact us at CIRP, info@constructionrehab.com. Let us know.
All right, everyone. Thank you again for coming. We will be here again next Thursday at 10 a.m. If you click on the check Facebook event for more information, we often put information and resources about our talk today up on that Facebook event, so you can click on that for more information. Other than that, be safe and well, and goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.
If you liked our video and you want to see more like it, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel.